President, inflation soared to a 31-year high in October. Now, after thinking about it, it seems President Biden and his allies are sensing inflation may endanger their reckless tax and spending agenda. Now, as a result, they have taken to arguing that the cure for inflation seems to be spurred by their reckless spending is to pursue even more reckless spending. I'm not buying it. The American people aren't buying it either. President Biden and his allies have been wrong about inflation from day one, and they are wrong now. Immediately after taking office, we all know what happened. They pursued a partisan $2 trillion liberal wish list package under the guise of COVID relief, and only 9% of it was to fight COVID. 9% of it was to fight COVID. Congress had already approved $4 trillion in bipartisan relief, including a nearly $1 trillion bill only a month prior to the president's inauguration. And all that money that was spent recovering from the Congress shutting down the economy March of 2020 was all passed in a bipartisan, cooperative way, not like bills this year are tuned up to just be a partisan, with the majority Democrats of the House and Senate supplying all the support. Now, our economy was already on the road to recovery when the president was sworn in, and highly effective vaccines were allowing economic activity to bounce back, and it did bounce back quickly. I, along with many on my side of the aisle, warned that adding $2 trillion on top of the existing relief, that money still entering the economy, risks sparking inflation, and it has. And it wasn't just Republicans sounding the inflation alarm. Longtime Democratic economist Professor Larry Summers, who held top posts in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, also made his inflation concerns known. So Democrats in Congress and the White House don't even heed the advice of their own. In a February Washington Post op-ed, Professor Summers warned President Biden's so-called COVID package might, quote, set off inflationary pressures of a kind that we have not seen in a generation, with consequences for the value of a dollar and financial stability, end of quote. 6 2/10% inflation just announced, which proves that Professor Summers was right. With a prominent liberal economist such as Larry Summers raising inflation concerns, now wouldn't one think the President of the United States would begin to take the risk of inflation very seriously? It's not how it's turning out. Instead, President Biden and senior administration officials are doubling down, arguing the real risk was not spending enough. Now think about that for a second. Congress had already spent almost as much responding to COVID, inflation-adjusted dollars, as it did waging World War II. Yet, we're somehow expected to believe too little spending, not inflation, is the real risk. In reality, President Biden and congressional Democrats were simply determined to not let a crisis go to waste. They couldn't let a, quote, high-class problem like inflation get in the way of passing, quote, the most progressive piece of legislation in history. How out of touch is that? Remember, inflation is a regressive tax that hurts the poor the most, increasing the cost of food, clothing, and shelter. In other words, affecting the basic essentials of life. Then, in the months to follow, inflation began to tick upward. In April, inflation clocked in at an annualized rate of 4.1%, the highest spike since the financial crisis of 2008. Nothing to see here, the Biden administration officials said. That inflation was solely due to base effects. That's their words, base effects, that resulted from prices being suppressed during the pandemic. In a month or two, they said inflation was to return to normal. Or you heard the word transitional inflation as Fed Chairman Powell was preaching to the entire country. Now, of course, Powell has changed his mind to some extent. Now, around this same time, President Biden released his reckless tax and spending agenda, calling for an additional, can you believe it, $4 trillion in spending. Professor Larry Summers again sounded the inflation alarm, warning, quote, "We are injecting more demand into the economy than the potential supply, and that will generate overheating," end of quote. Now skip ahead a month to June. Inflation surges to 5.4%. Again, the administration claims that there is nothing to worry about. Again, we're told inflation is merely transitory and solely the result of bottlenecks in the supply chain. Inflation remained at those elevated levels of 5.4% July through September. Inflation was persisting longer than the administration expected, but they were still sure it was only transitory. According to President Biden, no serious economist, those are his words, no serious economist was predicting spiraling inflation. Really? Larry Summers, a Harvard professor and former Clinton Secretary of Treasury, isn't a serious economist? I'll tell you how serious of an economist he is. I think he got on the Harvard staff at a very young age with the title of distinguished professor. And I think he was only about 30 years of age at that time. Then early this month, the inflation numbers for October were released. Inflation surged to 6.2%. That's the highest inflation rate in 31 years. Only then did the administration begin to acknowledge that inflation is a problem. To do otherwise would be an insult to the intelligence of the American public. Hardworking Americans have been experiencing historically high price increases for more than half a year. The Biden inflation tax on average Americans is now $175 a month, which equates to about an extra $2,100 of cost every year. Gone are the claims that inflation is transitory. Instead, according to President Biden, and I quote him, inflation hurts Americans' pocketbooks, and reversing this trend is a top priority. Now, President Biden and his allies claim the key to reversing this inflation trend is to enact the same reckless tax and spending agenda that they've been pursuing all year. How convenient. The solution to surging inflation is the same agenda he's been passing all along. I won't go as far as President Biden and say and try to claim no serious economist agrees with him. However, even the economists cited by the administration as supporting their agenda do have caveats. Those caveats include that their spending policies are entirely paid for and are structured in a way that will increase labor productivity. The current version of their spending plans doesn't come close to meeting those huge caveats. The president claims his agenda is completely paid for, but those claims rest solely on sleight of hand and budget gimmickry. Their largest gimmick comes from artificially sunsetting spending provisions that they do not intend to expire while imposing a permanent tax hike. In other words, increasing taxes and accounting it for over the 10-year period of time that the Congressional Budget Office looks ahead, spend that money in the first 2 or 3 years. And then supposedly the program's going to sunset. But everybody knows that these programs won't sunset, so you better figure what the long-term cost is. And that's that $4 2/10 trillion that's been in the press since this Build Back Better program was hit the press. Now, on another point, even taking President Biden's claim at face value, his agenda will result in hundreds of billions of dollars of increased deficit spending in the near term, fueling current inflation pressures. Moreover, according to Penn Wharton budget model and its analysis, under the more realistic assumption that their spending proposals are made permanent, their plan would increase debt and deficit by more than $2 trillion over 10 years. Penn Wharton budget model shows that. As a result, then by 2050, government debt would be 24% higher, economic growth would be 3% lower, and wages would be 1 7/10% less than they otherwise would be. Now, he calls his program Building Back Better. This is a recipe for building back worse. The bottom line is that the president's ill-designed spending and tax spree isn't deficit neutral, won't boost productivity, but it will fuel inflation. So I think after this October report comes out of inflation being the highest in 31 years at 6.2%, it's time to pause and rethink this entire approach.